The Vietnam War was a place where boys were forced to become men long before they were ready. In the thick jungle heat, where helicopters thundered overhead, boots sank into mud, and gunfire echoed through the trees, 1,000 young soldiers stepped into a world they never truly understood. Among them were teenagers who looked barely old enough to finish high school, yet found themselves walking the same trails as seasoned fighters, carrying rifles that felt heavier than their own futures. They came from quiet towns, busy cities, broken homes, and tight-knit families. Some enlisted out of pride, some because they felt they had no choice, and others simply because the world told them they were needed. Recruiters didn't ask many questions. Birth dates blurred, signatures appeared, and paperwork quietly passed through. What mattered was filling the ranks, even if it meant sending boys into a war that changed everything it touched. When these young soldiers arrived in Vietnam, the first thing they felt wasn't fear, it was disbelief. The heat, the smoke, the buzzing insects, the distant explosions, it all felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's nightmare. But reality hit quickly. Patrols through dense forests, nights soaked by monsoon rains, the constant beat of helicopter blades cutting through smoky skies. It wore them down day by day, moment by moment. Letters from home became lifelines. Small moments of laughter became rare treasures. And silence became a warning, not peace. This is the untold story of one of those boys. A teenager pushed into a world meant for grown men. His name could have been anyone's. His face could have been any you've seen in an old photograph. His story echoes thousands like him. Boys who carried rifles instead of textbooks, fear instead of dreams, and burdens far beyond their age. This is not just a war story. It is a story of innocence lost, courage found, and the impossible cost of growing up in the middle of a battlefield. The summer air in America was thick with promises of adventure, duty, and honor. Boys barely old enough to drive cars lined up at recruitment offices, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. Among them were teenagers who had grown up reading stories of war heroes, imagining themselves as brave and strong, never quite realizing what war truly meant. Paperwork was signed quickly, sometimes with forged birth dates, and before they knew it, they were on buses, trains, and planes, heading thousands of miles to a place they had only seen on maps. Training was grueling. Each day tested their bodies and minds in ways their quiet towns back home never had. They learned to march in formation, handle rifles, fire on targets, and respond to commands that required split-second obedience. Drill instructors barked orders, pushing the boys to their limits, but also teaching them to trust each other, to depend on their fellow soldiers, and to survive. Letters from home offered moments of comfort. A mother's reminder to stay safe, a sibling's joke. But the days in the barracks, the relentless drills, and the growing realization of what lay ahead often drowned out those moments. Then came the journey. Airplanes soared over oceans, bringing young soldiers closer to the thick, humid jungles of Southeast Asia. Helicopters rose and fell in the distance, the familiar roar both terrifying and oddly comforting. The boys stepped onto red earth for the first time, mud clinging to their boots, the air heavy with humidity and unfamiliar smells. Around them, older soldiers carried themselves with quiet determination, while others whispered warnings about the dangers ahead. Ambushes, booby traps, and the constant uncertainty that defined this war. Patrols through the dense jungle began almost immediately. Soldiers moved cautiously, scanning every shadow, every rustle of leaves, aware that enemy fighters could be waiting just out of sight. Rain soaked uniforms and weapons, turning the forest floor into a slippery maze. The heat pressed down relentlessly, sweat mixing with grime and exhaustion. Nightfall brought little relief. The jungle became a place of shadows where every sound could be deadly, and the young soldiers learned quickly that survival depended on vigilance, patience, and trust in those around them. They observed the devastation around them, villages scarred by airstrikes, civilians fleeing in fear, and the faint traces of firefights etched into the landscape. River patrols navigated narrow channels, scanning the thick mangroves for hidden dangers. Each turn of the boat, each step in the jungle, reminded them that danger was constant, that the smallest mistake could be fatal. Yet amid this chaos, moments of camaraderie emerged. Soldiers sharing rations, tending to the wounded, and finding brief solace in letters from home. The bond between them became unspoken, forged in the heat, mud, and fear of the frontline. Helicopters brought reinforcements, medevac missions, and supplies, their blades churning up mud and leaves as they landed in the midst of chaos. Explosions in the distance lit the night sky, shadows dancing across the faces of soldiers as they ducked into cover. They adapted quickly, learning to listen to the jungle, to move silently, and to anticipate ambushes before they happened. Every patrol was a lesson, every firefight a harsh reality check, and every day blurred into the next in a haze of fear, exhaustion, and fleeting moments of hope. Even in the darkest hours, small victories shone through. A soldier successfully navigating a minefield, a team rescuing a comrade under fire, a quiet night where the men could share stories and laughter despite the looming threats. These moments reminded them that even in war, humanity and courage persisted, and that the boy who had stepped off the plane only days earlier was slowly being forged into a soldier, learning the weight of responsibility, the sting of loss, and the courage it took to survive. By the end of his first month, the teenager who had arrived wide-eyed and trembling was no longer just a boy. He carried himself with cautious confidence, understood the rhythm of the jungle, and knew the value of trust and vigilance. But beneath the stoicism, the letters in his pocket reminded him of home, of family, of the innocence he had left behind. Each day tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally, shaping a young soldier in ways nothing at home could ever prepare him for. The Vietnam War had claimed thousands of men before him, and yet it had a way of teaching lessons only the living could understand. For this 17-year-old, every step through the jungle, every patrol, every night in the wet, dark forest, became part of a story of survival, fear, and courage, a story that would follow him far beyond the war itself. And as the sun set over the dense treetops, helicopters fading into the horizon, he realized that the war had already begun to change him, and that his journey, a journey into fear, brotherhood, and the loss of innocence, was only just starting. The moment the young soldier stepped off the transport plane, the reality of Vietnam hit him with a force far stronger than any drill or lecture back home. The air was thick, humid, and pungent with the scent of wet earth and foliage. Somewhere in the distance, the steady thrum of helicopter blades echoed across the dense treetops. Birds had gone silent, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Every step into the undergrowth brought a new awareness. The world here was alive, and it was dangerous. He wasn't alone. Around him, squads of soldiers moved with practiced precision, rifles slung and eyes scanning constantly for movement. Some had been here weeks, months, and their faces carried a hard, weary look that he could not yet comprehend. Others were, like him, just arriving, wide-eyed, unsure, carrying dreams and fears that seemed laughably small against the enormity of what lay ahead. In those first hours, the jungle seemed endless, a maze of green and shadow where one misstep could mean death. The young soldier soon learned that sound could betray you. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, even the buzzing of insects, could send a wave of panic through the men. Ambushes were a constant threat, invisible enemies striking from hidden tunnels or the thick undergrowth. Each patrol felt like a test, not just of skill, but of courage, instinct, and the ability to suppress fear long enough to survive. Night brought no reprieve. The jungle transformed into a dark, oppressive maze where even familiar paths seemed treacherous. Soldiers huddled in temporary shelters, listening to the night sounds with sharpened senses. The distant echo of gunfire reminded them that danger was never far away. Yet in those fleeting moments, stories emerged, laughter cracked through the tension, and small acts of humanity reminded them that they were still alive, still human, despite the chaos surrounding them. The first firefight was nothing like the young soldier had imagined. It was raw, chaotic, and terrifying. Explosions shook the ground, smoke and mud blurred vision, and every sound seemed amplified. The sharp crack of rifles, the shouted commands, the panicked breathing of men alongside him. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into an eternity. And yet, amid the fear, he moved instinctively, following orders, helping comrades, and learning what it truly meant to survive in a war zone. Days blurred into nights, each filled with patrols, maintenance, and brief moments of respite. Soldiers scavenged what little comfort they could find. A shared cigarette, a letter, a quiet word of encouragement. The young soldier discovered that courage wasn't about fearlessness. It was about continuing to move forward despite the fear, about trusting those beside you, and about keeping your humanity intact when everything around you demanded otherwise. Letters from home became lifelines. He would carefully read them under cover, tracing the familiar handwriting, imagining his mother's face, feeling a pang of longing for a world that now seemed impossibly distant. But the jungle never allowed him to linger in nostalgia. Each new patrol reminded him that every moment of inattention could be fatal. Booby traps hidden beneath layers of leaves, sudden mortar attacks, and the unpredictability of the terrain ensured that danger was omnipresent. The soldiers began to adapt. They learned to listen to the jungle, to the whispers of the wind through the trees, the movement of animals, the subtle signs of human presence. They learned to move with precision, to conserve energy, and to rely on each other for every decision. The young soldier, still only 17, found himself growing into a role he had never sought, but had no choice but to accept. He was no longer merely a boy, he was a soldier. Every scratch on his uniform, every bruise on his hands, every sleepless night added to the hard-earned experience, shaping him into someone capable of surviving the unimaginable. Amid the chaos, moments of quiet introspection appeared like small islands of solace. He would sit by a campfire, listening to the jungle hum, thinking of home, of the family he had left behind, and of the innocence that seemed like a distant memory. He began to understand the subtle truths of war. Courage existed alongside fear, hope alongside despair, and even in the darkest hours, small acts of kindness or bravery could leave a lasting mark. By the end of these early weeks, the jungle had already changed him. His eyes had grown sharper, his instincts quicker, and his understanding of survival deeper. He had witnessed bravery and cowardice, compassion and cruelty, life and death all in the span of a single patrol. And yet, beneath the hardened exterior, the memory of home and the boy he once was lingered. A reminder that war takes not just bodies, but innocence, and leaves behind stories that will echo for a lifetime. In those first weeks, he learned the unspoken rules. Listen more than you speak, trust your instincts, never underestimate the enemy, and value the men beside you as if they were your family, because in Vietnam, they were. Each day, each mission, each night spent under the canopy of a jungle that seemed both alive and merciless, molded him in ways he could not yet comprehend. And so, as helicopters roared overhead, and the sun began to set behind the dense foliage, the young soldier realized that the war was not just a distant conflict he had imagined back home. It was real. It was relentless. And it had already begun to leave its mark on everyone who dared to step into its green, shadowed heart. The young soldier had spent weeks adapting to the jungle, learning the rhythms of the land, the subtle warnings in every rustle of leaves, every chirp of insects. But nothing could prepare him for the first real firefight. The morning had started like any other. Heavy humidity, dense fog clinging to the treetops, boots sinking into mud that had become a constant companion. The squad moved cautiously, scanning the undergrowth, every man aware that at any moment, the comm could shatter into chaos. And then it did. A sudden volley of gunfire erupted from somewhere deep in the jungle. The sound was deafening, immediate, and confusing. Trees splintered under the assault. Smoke and dust blurred the vision, and the young soldier froze for a fraction of a second, long enough for fear to surge through his veins. He was only 17, and yet he was in the midst of life and death, surrounded by men who had become both comrades and anchors in this alien world. Instinct took over. Training kicked in. He dropped to the ground, ducked behind a tree, and returned fire without thinking. Around him, older soldiers shouted commands, moving with practiced efficiency, yet every sound carried the same terror. The snap of a rifle, the scream of pain, the distant boom of explosions. Time fractured. Seconds stretched into eternity. And amid the chaos, he realized he was not alone. The squad was watching his back, just as he would watch theirs. The firefight dragged on. Bullets tore through the foliage, leaving trails of smoke and fear. Men fell beside him, some shouting, some silent. The young soldier's hands shook, his heart pounded, but he continued moving, crawling, firing, and helping those who had been hit. One man's leg was pinned beneath a fallen tree. Without hesitation, the boy helped lift it free. Another soldier, older than his father, gave him a quick nod of gratitude before returning to the fight. In those moments, a raw, unspoken bond formed, a brotherhood forged in blood, mud, and fear. Hours passed like minutes. The jungle seemed to close in, hiding enemy fighters in every shadow. Sweat and blood mixed on the young soldier's skin, clothes, and rifle. His senses were heightened beyond anything he had known. Every movement, every sound, every flicker of light became a warning. Exhaustion gnawed at him, yet there was no choice but to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. By midday, the firing subsided, leaving behind a haunting silence. The smell of smoke and wet earth lingered, punctuated by the groans of the wounded and the quiet sobs of men too young, too scared, or too shocked to speak. The young soldier looked around, counting the squad, checking for injuries, and realizing for the first time the true cost of war. This was not a story of heroics. It was raw, it was painful, it was life and death in its most immediate form. In the hours that followed, the squad regrouped. The young soldier assisted in carrying the wounded to safety, administered first aid, and helped fortify their temporary shelter for the night. Every small act became monumental: a bandage, a ration, a reassuring word. Because survival was no longer just about skill, it was about humanity, and the jungle demanded it in full. Night fell. The dense canopy above blocked out the moon, leaving only shadows and distant sounds of the jungle at war. Men whispered in corners, tending to their wounds, cleaning their weapons, or quietly praying. The young soldier found a small moment to write in his journal, documenting the events, the fear, the courage, and the faces he would never forget. He wrote of friends lost, of moments where he had frozen and moments where instinct had saved him. Writing became a lifeline, a bridge to the world he had left behind, a way to hold on to the boy he still was beneath the uniform and helmet. The jungle had taught him lessons in just one day that would take months to unlearn. That fear is natural, but courage is choice. That every man around you carries a story as heavy as your own. And that survival is a collective effort, dependent on trust, instinct, and a relentless will to endure. By the end of that first real combat experience, he had grown in ways he could not yet articulate. He was still 17, still a boy in many ways, but the line between child and soldier had blurred forever. In the quiet of that night, as distant gunfire echoed across the hills and the first helicopters patrolled the horizon, the young soldier stared into the jungle, realizing that this was only the beginning. The battles ahead would test him further, strip away more of his innocence, and push him to limits he could not yet imagine. But he also knew, with a clarity born from terror and survival, that he would not face them alone, that the bonds forged in the mud, blood, and fear of Vietnam would become his anchor, his strength, and the only thing that might carry him through the days to come. After days of relentless patrols, firefights, and navigating the unforgiving jungle, the young soldier found moments of fragile quiet, fleeting hours where the war seemed distant, though never truly gone. In these rare pauses, the mind wandered to home, the small kitchen where his mother cooked, the laughter of siblings echoing down the hallway, the dusty streets of his hometown. Memories that once felt ordinary now carried an aching weight, a reminder of everything he had left behind. He reached into his pocket for the crumpled letters he had received from home. The paper was soft from repeated handling, the ink slightly smudged by sweat and rain. Each word carried warmth and fear, love and longing, messages that were both comfort and cruel reminder of the distance between him and the life he had known. One letter from his mother urged him to stay safe, to eat well, to take care of the boys around him, and to come home. Another, from a childhood friend, spoke of mundane events in town, yet each mundane detail felt like a lifeline, grounding him in a world that otherwise seemed defined by chaos and danger. The jungle at night was a different kind of enemy. Darkness enveloped the trees, turning familiar paths into a maze of shadows. Sounds became sharper, more pronounced. Insects buzzing, branches snapping, distant river currents, the low hum of a helicopter in the distance. Sleep was elusive. Every creak or rustle could signal danger. Every flash of movement prompted instinctive reactions. Even when alone for brief moments, the young soldier could not escape the constant tension that gripped him, a tension that made writing letters both a comfort and a necessity, a way to preserve his mind, his humanity, and the boy within him. Small acts of kindness among the soldiers became lifelines. Sharing a can of food, helping a wounded comrade, or quietly joking about some absurdity of jungle life brought relief, however temporary. These moments reminded the young soldier that war was not only destruction and death. It was also about connection, camaraderie, and the human will to survive. The men around him, though weary and scarred, were anchors in a world where everything else was uncertain. The boy also began noticing changes in himself. Fear was no longer paralyzing, but sharpened his instincts. He learned to read the jungle, interpreting subtle movements, shifts in the wind, and distant echoes as warnings. He discovered a resilience he hadn't known existed, a mental toughness born from necessity, a courage shaped by exhaustion, and the unrelenting knowledge that each day could be his last. Yet, beneath this new strength, he still felt grief, longing, and the hollow ache of lost innocence. Writing letters became an almost ritualistic practice. He described daily life without revealing too much of the horror, trying to protect his family from the harsh reality. Yet, The very act of writing forced him to confront his own experiences. The men he had seen fall, the screams that echoed in his memory, the smoke rising from distant firefights. Each letter balanced hope with despair, innocence with knowledge, childhood with the relentless truth of war. Occasionally, the squad would gather around a small fire, sharing stories of home, their dreams and fears. In these quiet gatherings, the young soldier realized that though the jungle was alive with danger, it was also alive with human stories, of bravery, sacrifice, humor, and grief. Every laugh shared was a rebellion against despair. Every hand extended to help a friend was a small victory against the overwhelming chaos surrounding them. Days turned into weeks. The young soldier continued patrols, carrying his rifle and letters alike, learning the delicate balance between vigilance and humanity. He noticed the toll the war took on older soldiers, men who had been hardened by months of combat, their eyes distant, their movements mechanical. And he realized that his own innocence was slowly eroding, replaced by a mixture of awareness, responsibility, and a growing sense of mortality that he could not escape. In quiet moments, he would trace his fingers over the letters, imagining the hands that had written them, the faces behind the words. These fragments of home became a shield, a way to preserve a part of himself, even as the jungle sought to strip away all traces of youth. The juxtaposition was sharp. In one hand, memories of childhood and home. In the other, mud-streaked rifle and the constant vigilance required to survive. As another monsoon rain drenched the camp, the young soldier huddled under a makeshift shelter, feeling the cold and wet seep into his bones. The jungle whispered around him, alive with unseen threats and hidden eyes. And yet, he held the letters close, reading them by the dim light of a lantern, clinging to the words, the connection, the hope that someday he might return to the world that existed before the war. By the end of Part 4, the young soldier had begun to understand the emotional landscape of combat. Fear intertwined with courage, despair with fleeting joy, loss with the relentless need to keep moving forward. He was no longer simply surviving. He was learning how to exist within the war, carrying not just a rifle, but memories, letters, and the fragile remnants of youth that the jungle could never completely consume. And as the night deepened and distant flashes of artillery illuminated the canopy, he realized that the lessons he learned in these moments of quiet reflection, of resilience, compassion, and human connection, would stay with him far longer than the echoes of gunfire ever could. Weeks in the jungle had hardened the young soldier, sharpening his instincts, yet nothing could prepare him for the mission that lay ahead. The squad received orders to move deep into enemy territory, a dense stretch of jungle rumored to harbor heavily armed Viet Cong units. The maps were sketchy, intelligence uncertain, and the danger unmistakable. Every man knew the risks, but there was no choice. Duty demanded they move forward. The journey was grueling. Mud clung to boots, rain slicked the leaves and branches, and the oppressive humidity sapped energy. Soldiers moved in tight formation, rifles raised, eyes scanning every shadow. The young soldier felt a mix of adrenaline and dread. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of foliage heightened his senses. The jungle was alive, and it watched them, a silent predator ready to strike. Suddenly, the ambush began. Gunfire erupted from concealed positions, sharp and unrelenting. Explosions shook the ground. Smoke and dust blurred vision, and chaos tore through the squad. The young soldier dropped to the ground instinctively, returning fire, crawling for cover, and scanning for his comrades. Around him, older soldiers reacted with practiced efficiency, dragging the wounded to safety, shouting commands, and coordinating a counterattack under relentless fire. Amid the chaos, the young soldier found himself performing tasks he had never imagined, pulling a fellow soldier out from a sudden blast, administering first aid with trembling hands, and carrying ammunition to those pinned behind fallen trees. Fear coursed through him, yet it was tempered by a clarity born of survival. Every action mattered, every choice could save a life, and hesitation could be fatal. The firefight stretched on for hours, the jungle echoing with the sounds of war. Gunfire, explosions, shouted orders, cries of pain, and the persistent hum of helicopters overhead. The boy, barely more than a child, moved with precision and purpose, relying on instincts honed over weeks of patrols and drills. He began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Amid the danger, small acts of heroism emerged. A soldier shielded another from gunfire, a team lifted a wounded man to safety, and the young boy himself carried supplies under fire, each movement an unspoken testament to bravery. Every life saved, every comrade protected, reinforced the bond among the squad, a brotherhood forged in mud, sweat, and fear. The enemy's position was finally breached after relentless effort. The squad regrouped, exhausted and bloodied, surveying the aftermath of the battle. Trees were splintered, smoke lingered in the air, and the wounded received care. The young soldiers' hands shook as adrenaline subsided, yet there was a sense of accomplishment, a fleeting recognition that despite fear, exhaustion, and chaos, they had survived and accomplished their mission. In the aftermath, the young soldier took a moment to reflect. The weight of the experience pressed upon him. The first time a life had depended on his decisions, the first time he had stared into the immediacy of death, and the first time he truly felt the cost of war. He realized that heroism in Vietnam was quiet, often unnoticed, marked not by glory, but by survival, empathy, and resilience. Nightfall brought a temporary calm. The jungle remained alive with hidden threats, but for a brief moment, the soldiers could rest, tending to wounds, cleaning weapons, and sharing small words of reassurance. The boy wrote letters to family again, documenting the day's events without revealing the horrors, preserving hope in the words he sent. He began to understand that these letters were more than communication. They were a lifeline, a way to maintain a thread to the world he had left behind. By the end of Part 5, the young soldier had faced the heart of danger and survived. He was no longer simply learning to navigate the jungle. He had become an active participant in the war, shaping the battlefield through courage, instinct, and action. And yet, beneath the growing confidence, he carried the weight of what he had seen. The faces of fallen comrades, the cries of pain, and the realization that the jungle would continue to demand everything he had, day after day, mission after mission. As the night deepened and distant echoes of combat faded into the darkness, the young soldier understood that the war was far from over. Each mission, each patrol, each firefight was only the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways unimaginable, and force him to confront not only the enemy in the jungle, but the war within himself. The jungle was quieter now, but the weight of the last mission lingered like a heavy fog. The young soldier moved through mud-slicked paths, helmet low, rifle in hand, his mind replaying moments he could never forget. Faces of fallen comrades flashed before him. Men who had laughed with him just days ago, now gone, leaving silence, grief, and the unshakable truth that survival often came at the cost of others. He had done everything he could to save lives, pulling wounded men to safety under fire, administering first aid with shaking hands. Yet one life had slipped through his grasp. The cry, the panic, the helplessness, it haunted him. Guilt settled deep in his chest, a constant companion alongside fear and exhaustion. He realized that survival was no longer just physical. It was an emotional battle, testing the limits of his young mind and spirit. Letters from home arrived sporadically, fragile lifelines in a landscape otherwise defined by fear and loss. Each message carried love, longing, and hope, yet they could not erase the memories of the jungle. Smoke curling from distant villages, flattened earth from artillery, and the eerie silence that followed each firefight. He traced the familiar handwriting, clinging to each word, imagining the faces behind them, and briefly returning to a world he could no longer inhabit. Patrols continued through dense foliage, river crossings, and abandoned villages. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every step might trigger a hidden trap. And yet, the young soldier discovered resilience he never knew existed. He learned to anticipate danger, to trust his instincts, and to rely on the squad, his makeshift family, whose survival depended as much on cooperation as courage. Night offered little comfort. The jungle whispered around him, alive with unseen threats. Sleep was broken by distant explosions, the rustle of leaves, or a lone animal moving in the undergrowth. In the dim glow of a makeshift shelter, he wrote again, recording the day's events, the fear, the moments of bravery, and the faces he would never forget. Writing became more than communication with home. It was a way to process the trauma, to preserve humanity, and to hold on to the boy he once was. He noticed changes in himself that were hard to recognize. Hesitation, sudden anger, protective instincts toward his squad, all marked the psychological toll of combat. He realized courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Yet trauma left invisible scars that training could not erase. Every patrol, every firefight, every encounter with death reminded him that war was as much a test of the mind as of skill. Amid the fear and exhaustion, small gestures of humanity stood out. Soldiers shared rations, offered a quiet joke to break the tension, and tended to each other's wounds with care. Each act, though small, carried immense weight, a reminder that survival relied not only on skill and instinct, but on compassion, trust, and the bonds forged in the mud and blood of the jungle. Days blurred into one another, each leaving a permanent mark on the boy. He had become cautious, deliberate, aware not only of the dangers around him, but of the emotional consequences of his actions. Each decision could ripple outward, affecting the lives of comrades, shaping moments of tragedy or survival. He had seen death, destruction, courage, and selflessness, learning that all existed together, inseparable, in this crucible of war. As rain fell gently on the canopy, and the distant echoes of artillery faded, he huddled near a fire, staring into the flickering flames. The jungle was indifferent and relentless, yet he remained determined to endure. Letters from home, memories of fallen friends, and fleeting moments of camaraderie intertwined, shaping a young man growing up too fast, learning lessons no child should have to learn, and discovering strength he never knew he possessed. He understood, more clearly than ever, that survival came with a cost, a toll measured not just in mud and blood, but in the shadows of the mind, the memories that lingered, and the fragile humanity he fought to preserve with every step, every breath, every heartbeat in the relentless, merciless heart of the jungle. After weeks of surviving ambushes, firefights, and the relentless pressure of the jungle, the young soldier began to notice a shift within himself. The squad sergeant had been wounded during a recent patrol, leaving the boy, barely 18, to take temporary command. Responsibility pressed down like the humid jungle air. Every decision could mean life or death, and the weight of those choices was almost unbearable. The mission that morning was simple in theory: secure a village rumored to be a Viet Cong supply point. In practice, it was a labyrinth of mud, bamboo thickets, and hidden dangers. Every rustle could signal a trap. Every footprint could mark an ambush. The young soldier led his men with careful precision, moving silently, signaling, and constantly scanning for threats. Fear still pulsed through him, but now it was accompanied by focus, purpose, and the urgent drive to protect those under his command. As the squad approached the outskirts of the village, the first signs of resistance appeared. A sudden burst of gunfire tore through the undergrowth. The boy reacted instinctively, shouting commands he had learned by observing his sergeant, directing men to cover and advancing strategically. He saw panic flash in some of the younger soldiers' eyes, but he steadied them with firm gestures and quick decisions, realizing that leadership was as much about instilling confidence as executing tactics. The firefight escalated. Smoke from explosions hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and burning foliage. Men ducked behind debris, returned fire, and called out to each other in a chorus of determination and fear. The young soldier moved from position to position, assisting the wounded, redistributing ammunition, and making split-second tactical choices that would determine whether the squad survived or fell. Amid the chaos, small acts of courage emerged. Soldiers covered each other's flanks, dragged the injured to safety, and relied on each other in ways only extreme circumstances can forge. The boy realized that leadership was not about authority or rank, but about presence, decisiveness, and the willingness to shoulder the same risks as those you commanded. He felt an unfamiliar pride, tempered by terror, exhaustion, and the knowledge that any mistake could cost lives. The squad eventually secured the village after intense combat. The air was thick with smoke, the ground littered with spent shells, debris, and the scars of battle. Despite the victory, the young soldier could not shake the faces of those who had fallen. Comrades, enemy combatants, and civilians caught in the crossfire. The lessons of responsibility were etched deeply into his mind. Command was both a privilege and a burden, and leadership in war meant balancing action with conscience. Night fell, and the squad regrouped in a temporary shelter near the village. The boy checked on every man, helping bandage wounds, distributing food, and quietly listening to their fears and concerns. He realized that leadership extended beyond the battlefield. It meant being present in moments of vulnerability, providing reassurance, and embodying the calm that others could cling to amid chaos. In a rare moment of quiet, he wrote in his journal, documenting not only the events but the emotions that ran beneath them. Fear, pride, sorrow, and the heavy realization that he was growing up in ways no child should have to. He reflected on the trust placed in him, the lives dependent on his choices, and the burden of knowing that the jungle would continue to demand more: courage, endurance, and sometimes unimaginable sacrifice. As the night deepened, the boy understood something fundamental. Survival was no longer just about his own life. Leadership meant carrying the weight of others, making decisions that could save or endanger, and learning to endure not only the physical challenges of combat, but the emotional ones as well. The jungle tested everything: strength, skill, and the heart, and the young soldier was learning to meet those tests with every breath, every step, every choice he made. By dawn, he was ready to lead again, aware that every patrol, every mission, and every encounter would continue to shape him, testing courage, judgment, and humanity in ways that would last a lifetime. The young soldier had grown into a careful, alert, and capable member of his squad, yet the jungle continued to test him in ways beyond physical endurance. Every day brought new challenges, not just from enemy fire, but from decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. Patrols through villages were no longer simple missions. Each interaction with civilians required judgment, restraint, and the constant awareness that a wrong move could have irreversible consequences. One morning, the squad came upon a small, bombed-out village. Smoke curled from shattered huts, and the once lively streets were eerily silent. Among the ruins, women and children emerged cautiously, faces etched with fear, grief, and suspicion. The young soldier froze for a moment, struck by the realization that these civilians were caught in a war not of their making. The rifles in his hands felt suddenly heavier, as if burdened with responsibility that went far beyond the mission at hand. The squad's orders were clear: secure the area, search for enemy activity, and ensure no weapons or supplies remained hidden. Yet in the eyes of the villagers, the young soldier saw the cost of every mission, every firefight. He had learned to shoot, to move, to survive, but he had not anticipated the emotional weight of realizing that even careful actions could bring suffering. He hesitated, measured each step, and tried to offer gestures of reassurance, sharing rations, helping rebuild makeshift shelters, and speaking softly despite language barriers. During another patrol, the squad stumbled upon a hidden booby trap. A villager had warned them too late, and an older soldier was injured. The young boy acted quickly, pulling his comrade to safety, defusing the trap as carefully as he could. In that instant, he understood that war was not only about fighting the enemy, it was about navigating a web of morality, chance, and human lives. Each choice could mean the difference between life and death, innocence and culpability, survival and guilt. As days passed, the psychological toll became more apparent. Sleep remained elusive, nightmares haunted the night, and the weight of decisions lingered long after patrols ended. He struggled with the knowledge that some actions were unavoidable, that sometimes harm came even when intentions were good. Writing in his journal became a lifeline, a way to process the tension between duty and conscience, between orders and the human cost of following them. Moments of camaraderie helped, but could not erase the burden. The squad shared whispered conversations about their fears, guilt, and regrets. They spoke of homesick nights, letters from family, and memories of those who had fallen. The young soldier realized that survival was inseparable from empathy, the ability to acknowledge the humanity of others, even in the face of constant danger. One evening, as he rested under a canopy of trees, distant artillery lighting the horizon, he watched villagers moving cautiously through mud-slicked paths. The boy understood that the war was not only a battle against an enemy, but also a struggle to maintain moral clarity, to reconcile orders with conscience, and to hold on to the fragments of innocence that still survived within him. By the end of these days, the young soldier had learned that courage alone was not enough. It required wisdom, compassion, and a steadfast commitment to the lives around him. The jungle demanded not just action, but reflection, not just survival, but understanding. He had entered the war a boy, trained to fight and endure, and he was slowly becoming a soldier who carried the weight of conscience alongside the weight of his rifle. Every step a lesson in morality and resilience. The jungle was thick and silent that morning, almost unnaturally so, as the squad moved along narrow paths, rifles at the ready. The young soldier's senses were heightened. Each rustle of leaves, each distant bird call, and every subtle shift in the wind set his nerves on edge. The air was heavy with humidity and tension, the kind that pressed down on the chest and made each breath deliberate. Suddenly, chaos erupted. From concealed positions along the trail, enemy fire rained down with shocking speed. Bullets tore through foliage, ricocheted off tree trunks, and sent clouds of debris into the humid air. The young soldier dropped to the ground instinctively, shouting orders he had learned under pressure, signaling his men to take cover, and returning fire with a precision born of weeks of relentless training. The ambush was relentless. Explosions shook the earth, sending shockwaves through mud-slicked paths, while smoke and dust obscured vision. Comrades fell on either side, the cries of the wounded piercing the roar of gunfire. Fear surged like electricity, yet amidst it, the young soldier found clarity. Every move had a consequence. Hesitation could mean death. Survival depended on split-second decisions, courage, and the ability to act despite terror. Amid the firefight, he witnessed acts of bravery that would stay with him forever. Soldiers risked their lives to drag the wounded to safety, cover each other's flanks, and maintain positions under overwhelming fire. The boy himself carried ammunition through the chaos, pulled a friend from an exposed area, and directed fire toward enemy positions with a focus that belied his years. In those moments, the distinction between fear and courage blurred, and every heartbeat became a measure of resilience. The jungle seemed alive with the presence of death, yet it was also alive with the raw determination of those who refused to surrender. The young soldier realized that war was a crucible, stripping away innocence, revealing true character, and forcing ordinary men into extraordinary actions. Each decision, each motion, each choice to act or hesitate was etched into memory, shaping not only the outcome of the battle, but the person he was becoming. As hours passed, the ambush gradually eased. The squad regrouped, battered and exhausted, surveying the aftermath. The jungle bore scars of battle, broken trees, scattered equipment, and the silent presence of lives lost. The young soldier's body trembled with adrenaline, his mind haunted by images of friends who would never see another sunrise. Yet in that exhaustion, he also felt a sense of accomplishment and survival. They had endured, they had acted with bravery, and they had held on to life against overwhelming odds. Nightfall brought no relief. The sounds of distant artillery and the soft rustle of leaves reminded them that danger was never far. The boy wrote in his journal, documenting not only the events but the emotions: fear, sorrow, courage, and the weight of survival. Each word was a thread connecting him to a world beyond the jungle, a way to process what he had endured and a reminder of the humanity that war threatened to consume. By the end of this ordeal, the young soldier understood the brutal reality of combat. Survival came at a price, and heroism often existed quietly, in the moments when ordinary men acted against extraordinary odds. The ambush had changed him, stripping away remnants of naivety, sharpening instincts, and deepening empathy for comrades and civilians alike. As the squad huddled beneath the canopy for the night, listening to distant echoes of gunfire and the hum of unseen insects, the young soldier realized that the jungle would continue to demand courage, resilience, and moral fortitude. The war was far from over, but he had survived its first true test, and the lessons of that day would shape him for the battles yet to come. The jungle had grown quieter, yet its shadows lingered in the young soldier's mind. Weeks of combat, loss, and survival had left marks deeper than any scar could show. As he moved cautiously along the muddy paths one last time, he observed the remnants of what had once been a thriving landscape. Villages reduced to rubble, forests scarred by explosions, and rivers swollen with debris. The war had reshaped everything, both around him and within him. He thought of the friends who would never return home, their faces etched into memory. The weight of their absence pressed on him, a mixture of sorrow, guilt, and gratitude for having survived. He reflected on the moments of courage he had witnessed, soldiers risking everything for one another, acts of humanity amidst brutality, and the quiet heroism of those who endured unimaginable trials. Those memories would stay with him forever, lessons etched into his very being. The young soldier had changed. The boy who had arrived in Vietnam full of fear and uncertainty had grown into a soldier who understood both the fragility and resilience of life. He had learned that survival was not just about skill or strength, but about courage, empathy, and the ability to make decisions under pressure. The jungle had demanded everything from him, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and he had met those demands with determination and heart. Yet, even in survival, there was a profound cost. Nightmares returned unbidden, the sounds of gunfire echoing in sleep. Moments of laughter felt heavy with remembrance, and letters from home carried both solace and pain. The boy had been forced to confront humanity at its most vulnerable and its most brutal, and those lessons could not be unlearned. He realized that the war would continue to live within him, shaping his thoughts, actions, and choices long after he left the jungle behind. As he walked along a riverbank, watching the sunlight glint off the water, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. The war had taken much, but it had also revealed strength he had never known he possessed. He could not undo the past, nor could he fully heal from its wounds, but he could carry forward the lessons of resilience, courage, and humanity. Every letter he had written, every act of bravery, and every moment of survival had forged a man from a boy, tempered by fire, yet unbroken. The jungle, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a teacher, harsh, unrelenting, yet imparting truths that no classroom could offer. He understood that the echoes of war would always follow him, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with muted hues, he paused, breathing deeply. He had survived the unthinkable, faced the unimaginable, and emerged with a sense of purpose and understanding. The Vietnam War had shaped him, scarred him, and strengthened him. And while the jungle, the battles, and the memories would remain forever, he stepped forward with the knowledge that survival was only the beginning, that the lessons of courage, empathy, and endurance would guide him for the rest of his life. In the end, he realized that the war was not only about battles fought and missions completed. It was about the resilience of the human spirit, the bonds forged in the darkest hours, and the unyielding hope that even in the midst of chaos, life could endure and humanity could survive.